Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 151 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk all about clematis with Jeff Jabko, Director of Grounds and Coordinator of Horticulture at Swarthmore College and the Scott Arboretum. The plant profile is on penstemon, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with Dr. Alan Armitage, who returns to share the last word on heat in the garden. This episode, we're joined by Jeff Jabko. He is the Director of Grounds at Swarthmore College in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, and also the Coordinator of Horticulture at the Scott Arboretum, which is on the grounds of Swarthmore College. Welcome, Jeff.
Hello, Kathy. How are you doing today?
Good. I am so excited to talk about everything clematis because it's one of my favorite plant families, and I just love vining plants in general, but especially easy to grow and fun and beautiful clematis. So we'll get into all things about that marvelous vine in a bit. But first, we want to talk about you a little bit, Jeff, and your background. And on the GardenDC podcast, we like to ask our guests, were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and or a green thumb?
I would have to say yes. I grew up in a suburban house in central Pennsylvania, a pretty rural area, small town, great little small town. And my parents were into gardening. You know, they had built their house not long after they had gotten married, and always took pride in a vegetable garden and a bit of landscape planting around the house and a nice clipped hedge and a pretty green lawn and all of that kind of thing. So that's kind of what I was born into. And I was just always fascinated with plants as a kid. And one of my earliest memories of actually planting something, and this seems so weird now, but on the edge of our vegetable garden, I would dig up from the vegetable garden little oxalis, with the little yellow flowers, the weed, which is actually, now is its time. It's like popping up everywhere in my home garden.
Pop it up everywhere. Yep.
I was digging those and planting those into my own little plot of the vegetable garden because I thought they were such a cute little thing. So that's that I can remember. And I was probably 6 or 7 years old or something when I was doing that. But anyhow, I started, being involved in all aspects of the garden and liking things and messing with it. I started taking care of neighbors' properties, mainly mowing their lawn and helping out with some other things. And then I got my first real job in horticulture when I was 14 years old. And I was working at a local landscape nursery. And that was just heaven to me to be able to do that. I loved it. It was just a couple miles away, so I could ride my bike to and from work. And so I'd work there a bit after school on Saturdays, and during the summer, I was working essentially full time. And it was a mom and pop operation. They had a bit of a garden center, bit of a nursery where they propagated some of their own plants and sold. And they also had a landscape crew that went out and did landscaping. So I had the opportunity to do all aspects of that. And at that time, I was, when I was really young, I was very interested in anything kind of artistic. And so I appreciated the beauty of flowers and a landscape and a landscape design. And the people I was working for, Mr. and Mrs. Biddle was their name, and they taught me a lot. And they had great reference books and, the Encyclopedia of Gardening and all of this kind of stuff. And I really just enjoyed looking at the landscape planning and drawings and all of that kind of stuff. So ultimately, I decided I really liked the artistic side, but I was very interested in science too. I mean, I loved science classes when I was in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I really focused. It's like, okay, what I want to do with my life is I want to combine something that's artistic with something that is science-based. And I wasn't necessarily thinking all that through then. It's just that, okay, I like plants. I like watching them. I love learning about all the new cultivars that are coming out and all of that kind of thing. I was fascinated to go to a nursery trade show and just seeing the variety of whatever type of plant that it was. So I decided I was going to, when I was finishing up with high school, to go to college then, where I majored in horticulture. I minored in landscape architecture, and my emphasis in horticulture was plant breeding. So that's kind of all how all of those things got combined. Then I went on to graduate school, and I was breeding small fruit plants. So I was really interested in small fruit production. So I had a chance to work with grapes and all the bramble fruits and blueberries and strawberries, all of that kind of thing. And I was combining plant pathology with it. So I was actually looking at disease resistance in grapes in North Carolina. And then after that, then I went back where I had been an undergrad, was Penn State University. And then I went back and worked for Penn State University for a while, for 6 years. And then I started here at Swarthmore and have been in this role of managing all the property of the college, and all of the developed part of the property is the Scott Arboretum, where our Arboretum is all around the college buildings. So it's around the residence halls, the academic buildings, the administrative buildings, and we have a number of intensive garden areas around all of that. So
Hmm.
that's kind of my background and history relative to horticulture. So yes, that's what I always wanted to do, and I've been able to do it.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like that chlorophyll green is running through you, and
Yeah,
so marvelous to know at a young age what you want to do and pursue that. That's so great.
yeah. I was lucky to be able to do that, and I, had some good mentors, both in college years, with the people that I first started gardening with, the Biddles, at their nursery and all of that kind
Hmm.
of thing. So that really helps.
Yeah, I think garden mentors and people you can work with. And the Biddles sound super lucky that they had you. I mean, they lucked out to have such an enthusiastic employee.
I think they would have liked me to have taken over the business when I finished up at Penn State as an undergrad.
Hmm.
Um, but I really had the interest in really learning more, and I was really interested in the plant breeding and all of that aspect of things, and just the opportunity of moving to a different area, learning different plants down in North Carolina, working with small fruit crops, which I was really interested in, all just really fascinated me.
Hmm. Do you grow any fruit crops or fruit trees in your own home garden today?
Yeah, actually, I do. I have a number of brambles. I've had blueberries. I've had cranberries over the time. Our property is too small for fruit trees. I do have some figs.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, a number of those things I still do.
Hmm.
Yes.
And for those listeners who are not in the Mid Atlantic area, let's describe Swarthmore College's location and maybe a little bit about the growing conditions there for them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Swarthmore, we are pretty much just southwest of the city of Philadelphia. So we're about, 15 or so miles outside of Philadelphia. We are our gardening zone. We are a cool zone 7. So we are really not all that different from DC. DC is probably a bit milder, but we are right here in this area where Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania meet. And we're drained by the Delaware River, which from here on campus, we are probably just a couple of miles away from the Delaware River. The area we're in is the Atlantic coastal plain, but the upper part of campus, because we're on a bit of a slope, is where the Piedmont starts. And the Piedmont is all kind of the hilly topography of the area outside of Philadelphia. If any of your listeners have ever been to Longwood Gardens is in the Piedmont. Okay,
Hmm.
so it's kind of the hilly area around that. And one
Hmm.
of the nice things here in Swarthmore, in this area of, we call the Delaware Valley, we have lots of public gardens. So lots of places for people to go to. And for those of us in the profession, we have lots of friends who are also in horticulture. So lots of people to be able to ask questions or learn from, or share, commiserate with. So all of that kind of thing.
Hmm. And I was lucky enough to visit the Scott Arboretum on campus last summer with the Perennial Plant Association. And I will say you described it as a cool zone 7. That day it was a little hotter zone 7. That
Yeah,
was
yeah.
August for sure. But I do remember it was a bit of a hill to get there, and it is
Mhm.
a hilly campus. It's not like a really flat with a
Right.
big quad in the middle type of campus.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Our main quad actually slopes
Hmm.
by a significant amount going down the slope. Yeah.
Yep. And we should also let people know it's free and open to visit at any time for anybody to walk through, correct?
That's right. And if you just go to scottarboretum.org, you'll find all about it. You can actually, through Arboretum Navigator, look at all of the plants that we have available, or you can map them out. You can also get a virtual tour, look at our garden areas. And we always say that the Arboretum is open sun up to sunset every day of the year. And lots of local people use us basically as a public park to come and enjoy the campus.
I can
Um,
imagine.
yeah,
And the students as well. It's such a beautiful campus.
right. I mean, as I said, the students are surrounded by the arboretum, so all of their years here. Many of them, they really take advantage of that, and we hire as many student workers as we're able to. So, Swarthmore College is an undergraduate liberal arts college, and horticulture is not taught here, and everyone thinks that that is so peculiar.
Mm,
But that's just not in the curricula of the college. But we give all of the students who want the opportunity to work and learn about plants and landscaping and gardening the chance to do that if we can.
hmm. And I'm sure it sells a few tuitions as well when people
Yeah,
come and visit in the summertime.
yeah. Whenever anyone's coming there, they're always many alums come back and tell us that one of the things that their first impression of campus was the beauty of the campus and the arboretum and the plants surrounding all of the buildings.
Hmm.
We also have a 200-acre woodland just adjacent to campus with trails and the Crum Creek that runs through it.
Yeah, I was going to say that I know you do like a rose festival and a couple horticultural
Yeah.
professional events
Yes.
that are open to the public too. Maybe we could just cover some of the highlight events that you host there really quickly.
Yeah. Well, just 2 weeks ago, we had our first ever Peony Palooza
Mm.
with the Mid Atlantic Peony Society. And we were open for 2 full days. And this was a peony competition, peony display, peony flower arrangements, activities for kids to get involved with peonies and do some of their own flower arranging. And we gave out ribbons and all kinds of things. We had several hundred people coming in over those couple of days to do that. And last week was our annual rose celebration. So we typically have that the first week of June or very beginning of June or very end of May, depending on how the college calendar goes. And it's a late afternoon and evening activity during the week because we find that's the best time to get families to come. And over the 4 hour period, we had over 500 people here for it. And the Rose Garden was at its peak. And one of the nice things about the Rose Garden is we also greatly feature peonies in that garden, which we're just kind of finishing up. The last of the peonies were there, but also we feature a lot of clematis in that garden also, because roses and clematis, climbing on each other really, really go together because their
Hmm.
bloom times are overlapping.
Yeah, such a classic combination.
Yeah. And then a couple of the other activities we have in summer, we have a Woody Plant Conference, and this is co-sponsored with several other local groups: the Hardy Plant Society, Longwood Gardens, Chanticleer, Morris Arboretum, Pennsylvania Hort Society, and then in October we have the Perennial Plant Conference, and that's another co-sponsored one with Longwood Gardens, Hardy Plant Society, Chanticleer, and Pennsylvania Hort Society.
Excellent. So, highly recommend attending all of them or some of them if you can get up there. And I definitely want to get to that peony festival if I can next year.
Yeah, it was a great time.
I love peonies so much. So let's turn to the topic of the hour, clematis, or should I say clematis? And that's going to be our first discussion. Is the pronunciation always comes up? So how do you say it, Jeff?
Well, growing up, I called it clematis. But then since I learned that the correct botanical pronunciation is clematis, so the
Hmm.
accent is on the first syllable. But, you can really say either way,
Mm-hmm.
but the botanical pronunciation would be clematis. Um, in England, or even some people say clematis. So
Hmm.
they have kind of put their own accent to it. But in general, the majority of people call it clematis. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I hear it the most. But yeah,
Yeah.
tomato, tomato, it's
Yes.
all the same.
Exactly. Yep.
As long as you're spelling it correctly, it
Yeah.
gets across. But
Yeah.
yeah, if you could try to remember Clem, you know,
Hmm.
some
Yeah.
as if it's somebody's name,
Yeah.
Clematis,
Yeah.
that helps a little bit. And it's not the prettiest sounding word for such a nice plant. It's kind of like,
That's right.
yeah. So let's talk about the origins of clematis, where
Hmm.
they are native to in the world, and how they do for us here in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah. Well, actually, clematis are pretty much native all around the world.
Hmm.
So we have a number of ones that are native to North America. So, just around here, Clematis virginiana,
Mm-hmm.
a small white flowered, flowers in midsummer through late summer, but also, especially in southeastern United States, we have many clematis, and these are the bell-shaped clematis.
Hmm.
And those are kind of the hot new thing. There are a couple of researchers who are really exploring these out in the wild because, believe it or not, we still have some unnamed species of these plants. So
Wow.
some that are very specific to certain areas of the southeastern United States. Clematis texensis is native to Texas, and that occurs in a lot of hybrid clematis that we use in the garden that people might be familiar with all the time. Or
Mm-hmm.
some of the red tulip shaped blossoms. I just in my garden just this week are flowering um, Princess Diana, Sir Trevor Lawrence, that's another one that has that kind of look that Texensis is in it. So it is in a lot of our hybrids.
Hmm.
Many of the larger flowered, especially the big flowered ones, the ones that are flowering around Mother's Day, those are from some hybrids that are mainly from Asia. And so, those would occur in some in China, Korea, some other areas in Asia. And so those have been hybridized and selected with many other species over time. But there are actually species growing, pretty much all around the world. They consist not only of the vining clematis, those that sprawl and vine and attach through trees or shrubs or whatever in the wild, but some that are more like an herbaceous perennial, where they grow almost kind of shrub-like or sprawling on the ground, and then they die back, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
actually attach or climb to anything.
Hmm.
So there are all those different types that are like that.
Hmm. The native Clematis viorana is one I have in my garden, and vase vine, I think, is one of the common names
Yeah,
for it.
Viorna, Clematis
Viorna.
Viorna. Yeah,
Yeah, I always like stumble over the Latin for that
yeah,
name.
yeah,
But that is blooming now in my garden, and it is just the cutest little
yeah.
thing. It's a little purple upside down vase,
Yep,
as you would describe,
yep.
with a green kind of almost chartreuse edging to it. And so my
Hmm.
two favorite colors, just a
Yeah.
beautiful, well behaved little vine. But I've been warned it could take over a little bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, even though most of those are going to die back to the ground in the winter, during the season they could get 8 to 10 or 12 feet long or tall, depending on what they're growing on. So some can be, if they're happy, they can really, really grow quite aggressively. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, the person I obtained it from, a native plant seller at an event, said he got it from a ditch.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
somewhere along a
Yeah.
roadside, it was scrambling along.
Right.
So that
Right.
kind of tells you that A, it's a tough plant,
Right.
and B, it's a good grower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk about the hardiness of clematis. So it has a reputation, kind of like roses do, even though they're super tough plants as well, and kind of like peonies, that they're picky plants.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think they have a very wide hardiness zone, and they will come back after a lot of abuse, like, basically cutting them almost to the ground. What has your experience been?
Yeah. I mean, so probably some of the most cold hardy ones, or ones that have the species of um, Clematis viticella, and there's also some of the easiest ones to grow. So these are native to Europe, the viticellas, and they typically would die back or almost die back to the ground every year. And then during the season, they can grow, 8 to 10 feet tall within that season. And they are just starting to flower now in my garden. So these have been used in lots of selecting and hybrids from over the years. So we have a whole range of colors for the Viticella types. Um, those, because they die back to the ground, the roots are very cold hardy, so they can grow, way up into zone 4, no problem at all. So they really have good cold hardiness. If it is some of the types where the stems stay alive above ground, so these would be some of the larger flowered ones that were flowering around Mother's Day, or ones that are just starting to come into flower now, those are with some species from China that are not quite as cold hardy. So those stems, so these are mainly you're going to get, especially for the ones that are flowering Mother's Day, they're going to flower on the stems where the stems stayed alive over winter from last year. So they basically would be flowering on what we would say are flowering on old wood. If the winter would get really cold, those stems might die back. So those would be more of a tender plant to grow very, very far north, like up in zone 4. So it might just be difficult to grow those there. Or Clematis montana, which Clematis montana you should have no problem growing around DC. I grow it here in my garden. There have been 1 or 2 winters over the years where it would die back almost to the ground because we had really, really cold weather during the winter that lasted a long period of time. But typically, I would say from the Philadelphia area south, most of those would be plenty hardy for Clematis montana.
Hmm.
And those flower very early. Those are flowering in April. So you can get a whole range of different types like that. And many times in gardening, you can adjust when things are going to flower by the pruning, which can get people always get very, very confused about the pruning, and we can talk about that
Yes.
later on.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason it can get so confusing is when does the plant on its own want to flower, and then we just need to learn how to work with those specific plants to do that. So sometimes trying to put them into a specific category is not helpful that way. Because remember, these are hybrids. So, even though it might be in a certain group of hybrid, it doesn't mean that it responds completely like everything else because it's not identical genetically to the other ones. So
Hmm.
that's the plant breeder in me coming out talking that way.
Yes, and it does help if you know the hybrid's provenance and what the combinations are. But often, a home gardener purchasing a plant at a garden center, it's not even going to have the Latin on the tag a lot. So,
Right, right. But if you get a cultivar name, you can always look up the cultivar name, and there are some great resources to find that. So you don't have to own, the Encyclopedia of Clematis to figure all of that out. There is a wonderful organization, the International Clematis Society, which I am immediate past president of. And so it's a worldwide group of people very interested in clematis. And we are sponsors now of a website called Clematis on the Web. And so if you want to search on, and the website is clematisontheweb.org. So no spaces in the Clematis on the Web. And that will take you to a site that you have all different types of options to look through pictures or to search by a cultivar name or species name of a clematis. And it will tell you all about it. It will tell you about pruning. It will give you some pictures. It will tell you where it is native to. If it's a hybrid, it will tell you what the parents are, if that is known. It will tell you who introduced it and what year, all of that kind of stuff. So there's a way to at least, if you know the cultivar name, to research it a little bit and find out, okay, when should I be pruning this? Or, what does it really look like? Is that what I really have, kind of thing?
excellent. I'm looking at the website right now, and we'll include a link in our show notes. But
Okay.
super valuable because yes, that is the most asked question about clematis and the most
Yeah.
confusing points. So that people have this fear of pruning it wrongly, pruning it at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So maybe we can jump into a little bit of that and go
Yeah.
by category and just knock that out, and then talk about some of the fun varieties that we
Yeah.
love in a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so for the pruning, Don't be afraid to prune. And remember, the worst that you would do is cut the plant back to the ground. So if you do that, you're not going to kill the plant. You might be sacrificing that year's blooms or that spring's blooms. So if you get a plant that you really don't know anything about, you don't know the name of it or whatever, the first year or two, just don't do anything to it. Just let it grow. But pay attention to when does it flower without any pruning at all. And that might tell you some things. If it dies back to the ground, okay, that's what you know. It's going to die back to the ground. The stems don't typically stay alive, and so it's going to regrow from the base every year. All right. And if it is one of the vining types, then what you need to pay attention to is when does it flower? Does it flower very early, like April, on wood that was produced last year? Okay, that would put it into a certain aspect. And if it was in that kind of group, that's what we would formally call group one pruning. Now, we don't like to use these groups of 1, 2, 3 anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of times that's what you're going to see on the nursery tag.
Yeah. I also
Because
see ABC.
yeah, so
Yeah.
same thing. So
Mm-hmm.
A is 1,
Mm-hmm.
B is 2, C is 3. But when we're trying to get people to think of it differently, because if we say prune that way and you're in upstate New York or are you in South Carolina, it doesn't necessarily work that way, okay, for some of these hybrids, because it's going to depend on what your climate conditions are for where you are. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, when does it flower on its own? And is it flowering on old wood or new wood? Okay. So if you pay attention to that type of thing. So if it is this group that we were calling, group A or 1, flowers very early. And for us, in the DC area, the Philadelphia area, I would say these are flowering in anywhere from second week of April to the first week of May. Okay. Clematis montana would be the main one in that group. A little bit farther south than Philadelphia, you can grow Clematis armandii, which is an evergreen one. I've had mine growing a number of years and then I lost it. But I even know down around Baltimore, they do really well. And
Mm-hmm.
I would think in DC area, they would do perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that are going to be flowering even earlier. Very, very fragrant, beautiful plants. But it's just a little too cold for us to grow that here. Those were ones for the Montanas and the Armandii. They would, if they were called that group 1, you would do the pruning after they flower. And all that you really do is trim it back. Because especially Montanas can put out 10 or 12 feet of growth in a year. If you did not do any pruning, in 3 or 4 years in a mature plant, all the flowers would be out 30 and 40 feet from the base of the plant. So every year right after flowering, you need to trim it back a little bit so that you can try to keep it in a manageable size. So that's why that you would want to prune that way. Because remember, these plants, unless they are a hybrid, no one prunes them when they're growing out in the wild, and they still flower and they still reproduce. But what we're trying to do is take best advantage to get the most flowers in a garden setting. So that's why we're doing this pruning. The next kind of season for flowering would be what is happening in May. So usually I figure from early May to mid-May or beginning of June. Many of these are really large flowers. So you could have
Mm-hmm.
flowers anywhere from probably 3 inches up to 7 inches across. This was a group that we previously called the early large flowered
Mm-hmm.
hybrids. Okay. So they flower very early for us, some of the really big ones. And it was an interesting story. This year, I was noticing we had a really nice flowering spring this year for all kinds of things. We had a mild winter. We had enough of moisture going through early spring. We didn't have any late frost. Temperatures were cool. We had a couple spells where it reached low 80s, but other than that, the temperatures were cool, but not cold nights. So flowers lasted a long time on all kinds of things. But I noticed how many gardens I was seeing that had these that were flowering in early to mid-May. And it finally came to me why. The time when most people are going to a garden center to buy plants is early May, right around Mother's Day. Mother's Day is always the second Sunday of May. So these are the ones that look great in the garden centers at that time. This is when they naturally flower.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
it's a Mother's Day syndrome. It's
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure not
Yeah.
just in clematis, but it's in
Oh, right.
roses,
Everything. Yep.
azaleas, peonies. That's why they're so popular is because they're
Yep.
flowering around that mid-May time.
Yeah. But I do have to say the clematis that are flowering then, most of these are what are they're very large flowered, they're hybrids. They're probably the most challenging clematis to grow. Not that they're difficult, but they're the most challenging. And that is because of their requirements. So with these, the pruning that you would normally do, and this would be in late winter, so anywhere from late March to, or excuse me, late February to mid-March, something like that, before the growth really starts, we might see the bud swelling, is you're going to cut these back to maybe like 3 feet tall. All right. And then those buds that are still, in that remaining 3 feet, they are going to grow out and flower. So that shoot is going to originate from old wood, from last year's wood, and that's where you're going to have that flowering in that early May period. Now, what would happen if you didn't prune it at all? You might have a little tip die back on it. So maybe it dies back a foot or two because these might reach, 8 feet tall or something like that. Maybe they die back a foot or two at the top. And then those buds all the way out would grow and flower. You would actually get more flowers, but your plant would get much larger. So once again, if you didn't do any pruning for a couple of years, all of your flowers would be way out at the tips and you would have nothing near the base of the plant. So most gardeners just aren't really prepared to have anything get that big. You want your flowers kind of in this space of up to 6 feet tall kind of thing. So if you didn't do pruning, the flowers would just be much farther out.
Hmm.
You just have a little bit of natural dieback at the tip each year. So the plants just get too big. And with that, if you cut it all the way down, so you cut it back to 6 or 8 or 10 inches or 12 inches,
Mhm.
okay, you're going to sacrifice the flowers that you would get in early May, but all of that growth that's going to come out, you're going to have flowers later than in late June, July, maybe August. So you just delay the flowering if you
Hmm.
cut it back too hard. So you're not going to kill it, but you're just going to get flowers at a different time.
Mhm. And you might actually wanna do that on purpose sometimes.
Exactly. The other thing you can do, and something that we really don't do in the United States so much, and I've learned a lot from my European friends in the International Clematis Society, is after those large flowered ones that flower in the early part of May, once they finish flowering, do a bit of deadheading and cutting back of the shoots a little bit. I mean, a little bit, maybe a foot, 2 feet, something like that, and make sure that the plant has a good watering at least once a week. If we don't have a good rain, give it a good bucket of water once a week. You'll get new shoots that come out that most likely will give you a second flowering in summer. Now, it might be July, it might be August, it might even be early September, but you will get more flowers in through the season then. So you can actually get those to flower twice a year by doing that type of thing.
Hmm. And so that's cutting back maybe 6 to 12 inches?
So you're right at the end of flowering. You basically
Mhm.
you deadhead and you just trim it back a little bit, trim the shoots back a little bit.
Okay.
So they're going to be buds, in the axils of those leaves farther back, and those are going to put out new shoots that are going to get a couple of feet long that are going to set new flower buds.
Great, good to
Yeah,
know. And I
yeah,
love that you did answer my question that I was going to ask about what if you never prune at all? Like
yeah,
what's
yeah,
the harm in that and letting it
yeah,
go? But you're just pruning more to cultivate more flowers and to have them at a more visible full level.
yeah. And then what you would see in the that last group of pruning, so that'd be the group C or the group three.
Mhm.
Um, And these would be a lot of the Viticella types, the Viorna type, like you had mentioned, things that might have integrifolia or diversifolia in, which are some other species or hybrid species. Um, these are the ones I always say, if you're going to give a gift to a new gardener, give them a clematis that would be in that group. Or if you haven't grown before, here's the ones that you should start with. The reason is they tend to be very forgiving, very easy to grow. They tend to be vigorous, especially if they have some Viticella in them. They do wonderfully in our area. They come in all range of flower colors, sizes, shapes. So there's a wide diversity to pick from. And pruning is really easy. Basically, you cut them back. I always say cut them back to, somewhere between 6 and 12 inches. And you do that in late winter. So anytime late February to the middle of March, just cut them back 6 to 8 inches. Make sure they have a trellis or something to grow on, up through a shrub, into a tree, whatever. They're going to grow, and they are just starting to flower now. So I probably have a half a dozen of different ones of this type, different cultivars flowering in my garden right now. No, it's probably more than half a dozen. Now that I'm thinking of it, it's probably more like 12 or 15 different types. um, so uh, so it's they're very easy to grow that way, and it makes pruning easy. I always find that people in that last group we talked about, the flowers in May, it's like, well, I'm supposed to cut it back to 3 feet. Did I cut it back too much? Not enough? They really worry it to death.
Mm-hmm.
This other group is like, no, just cut it back 6 to 8 inches, or even up to 12 inches. Then forget about it. Give it something to grow on, and it'll do just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, what if you didn't prune that? There'd be a natural little. So many of these are very vigorous. Some of these could get anywhere from 6 to 8, 10, even 12 feet in a season. All right. So that is if they have good moisture and enough of fertility in the soil, they could actually get that big. If you did not prune them, the tips will die back a little bit, but all the rest of that cane that grew last year, that vine that grew last year, is still going to be alive. It's going to put out another 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 feet of growth with flowers on that. So this is even more extreme than the first group I was talking about. So the flowers are going to be way out at the end, and then you get no flowers in that 2-year-old wood or 3-year-old wood that you haven't pruned back. So all the flowers are going to be way out at the tip. So that's why we prune those back and prune them back that severely every year. So if you inherit one of these, you move into a place where it hasn't been pruned and your flowers are way out at the tip.
Mm.
Okay, wait till next winter, cut it back that hard, let it regrow, and then see when it's going to flower. Is it going to flower then at this time in June? So that would be the way to treat that. But those really are the easiest ones to really get started with clematis.
Hmm. Good advice. And yeah, that will take some of the fear out of it. But then that you always are, have a little trepidation about those first severe cuts.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
experiment and know that you're probably not going to kill it. So that's good
Mm-hmm.
advice.
Mm-hmm.
And how about the fall blooming ones? And I'm going to bring up
Yeah,
the
yeah.
invasive one. Um,
Right. The sweet autumn
the
clematis.
sweet autumn clematis
Yeah,
that a lot of us planted, a
yeah,
decade plus ago, and it is trying to take over the world now.
yeah. I planted one. Let's see, I moved into my house around 1992, and I planted one at the base of a Norway maple. Ultimately, I got rid of the Norway maple, of course. Um, and then I got rid of that plant a number of years later. I still have seedlings coming up in that bed.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's why we really don't recommend it. It is
Yep.
very invasive. The seeds just spread by the wind and they will pop up everywhere. I mean, it smells wonderful. They really are quite beautiful. But if you want something that looks like that, gives you the same type of idea, our native Virginiana does that. And it's not as invasively aggressive. You could still grow them from seed, but you don't see seedlings popping up everywhere like you do the sweet autumn clematis.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, some nurseries are still selling the sweet autumn clematis, but it's one that we just do not recommend to be grown at all.
Yeah, I would avoid it. It's coming up everywhere, though I've, tried to kill it several times.
Yeah,
That does
yeah,
show you some of the vigor of some of the clematis
oh
vines.
yeah, yep, yep, yeah. I mean, it's really just tolerant of, you know, pretty much all of our growing conditions, anywhere from the deep south. I'm just thinking of the eastern seaboard, from the
Mm-hmm.
deep south, probably all the way up into southern New England or even the middle of New England. Probably doesn't grow farther north than that; it'd be getting too cold. But yeah, it really is tolerant for a pretty large area and all different types of conditions too.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
so a little bit ago, you talked about vining up your clematis through a tree, a shrub. Some of them like
Hmm.
to scramble on the ground. So let's
Yeah.
talk about some of the good companions
Hmm.
for clematis.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that I really like to grow them is through other things. So in our rose garden on campus, for example, we do have some on trellises. We have some climbing roses. So we'll have them kind of paired with the climbing roses. So they would grow right along and they would use the rose or the trellis itself for attachment. We have some that are just growing in between, shrub roses. So they kind of lean or grow in through and amongst these other ones. So remember earlier I said about clematis, some are going to attach and some
Mm-hmm.
are not.
Mm-hmm.
So some examples of like the cultivar, Arabella or Alyanushka, these are ones that I say they're leaners. They can get 3 and 4 feet tall, but they don't actually attach to anything. They'll kind of grow through or sprawl or lean into other shrubs or herbaceous perennials around them for support. So those are ones that you could let sprawl in the ground or just kind of do their thing in amongst other plants. But then the clematis that are actually climbing and attaching, the way they attach, it's very different from ivy or other vining plants that you might have. Clematis will have a stem and they have paired buds going along the stem so that the buds are opposite each other along the stem. And then you would have a leaf that comes out from that. And typically that leaf, the stem of the leaf called the petiole, is attached to the stem, and the petiole is bare, and then it will usually end up in 3 little leaflets out on the end. So what attaches, it's actually that petiole or the stalk of the leaf is what will twirl or wrap around something. And that's how the vine's going to attach onto something. Okay. So it's not like um, something that's going to have a holdfast like Virginia creeper, or it's going to have a little like almost like aerial root, which attaches to something like English ivy. So they actually just wrap around something. In order for that to wrap around something, it has to be a relatively thin diameter. So the largest diameter is about the diameter of a pencil. If it's larger than that, the petiole really can't wrap around it. So you can't really grow a clematis on a wooden lattice trellis. Because it's not going to be able to wrap on. You might be able to weave it in through the individual wooden lattice pieces or
Mm-hmm.
to tie it in, but it's not going to self-attach to it. Unless that the vines are going up on both sides and the petioles are kind of reaching through and attaching to other stems of the same plant. So you have to tie it in. So the important thing is when you're thinking of some sort of structure or trellis for it to grow on, it needs to be, the diameter of a pencil or smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So just keep that in mind for whatever structure you're growing it on. Other than, like I say, you're actually going to be tying it onto the structure.
Yeah, I think of it like kind of like pea vines, similarly, where they grab onto, and definitely
Right.
something pinky width or thinner. Pencil is a great description to
Yeah.
have something to grab
Yeah.
onto there. I've used like those thin green garden stakes to
Hmm.
guide clematis,
Right.
like get it started and kind
Yes.
of lean it towards something. So then it will finally grab the more decorative trellis that I want it to go on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I was going to ask you for best trellising materials.
Yeah. Well, and actually, that using small sticks like that too. So some of those are the dyed bamboo sticks or something
Mhm.
like that, but of
Mhm.
a thinner size. That's how you would get it to like grow up into a tree. So if it's a low branch tree, to get the clematis up into those lower branches, and then in a tree or in a shrub, growing it at the base of a shrub, there are plenty of the outer branches that would be of the proper diameter for the clematis to attach to. So for materials, I mean, I have a stone house, and I have a southwest corner of the house that is right next to the driveway, and I thought it needed to be softened. So I have a clematis, a Polish spirit, is the cultivar, and it's just started flowering. It's a wonderful. The Polish spirit is that's probably my go-to plant for a novice gardener. I will
Mhm.
always buy them a clematis Polish spirit. It's wonderful, purple, just beginning to flower now, flowers for a long time. When it's done flowering, you can cut the whole plant back by a half. And then give it some water, a bit of fertilizer or compost, and you'll get another crop of flowers late in the summer. But this growing on the corner of my house, the clematis is not going to grow up a stone wall. It's not going to self-attach. So what I've done is I've gotten some garden wire fencing, and I use the openings. The diameter are 2 by 4 inch, so 2 by 4 inch openings in the wire fencing. You can usually get this in widths of 3 feet or 4 feet wide. And so I will cut it to the length that I want it to be, and I anchor it into the stone where I have a couple of masonry nails going into the mason between the stones, and then wire this wire mesh on the outside of that. You don't want the wire mesh, or if you're using a plastic mesh or a garden netting or something like that, you don't want it right on the face of the stone or a wooden fence or your siding of your house. You want to project it out 1.5 to 2 inches or even 3 inches, because the plant needs to be able to get around and back to wrap around it. If it was flush to the wall, you wouldn't be the plant's petioles wouldn't be able to wrap around it. So
Mhm.
you want to project it out from the wall just a little bit. And so I have this going up the corner, and my Polish Spirit, which was it's one of the Viticella types. It was cut down to the ground. I cut mine down to about 6 inches high in late winter, and now it is up probably 9, maybe 10 feet tall and flowering, just starting to flower all along it. So it's really beautiful, easy
Mhm.
one to do that with. So I like to use that wire mesh in instances like that. Um, in my vegetable garden, right now flowering is Clematis violacea. I have it growing up on my thornless blackberries. So the thornless blackberries are just starting to flower right now, and my clematis is flowering along with it. So the clematis actually uses the stems of the blackberry as its support. So that's a really nice kind of ornamental feature in the vegetable garden. So I like to use structures like that, but also I build a lot of makeshift uh, garden posts. And I'm not just, I'm not thinking of a 4 by 4 post. Um, but what I do is I get a piece of metal rod, reinforcing bars or rebar, which you can get at a big box, hardware type of store. These are metal rods, very kind of rough looking. They will rust to a dark brown color. They're used as reinforcing metal in concrete structures. So that's why they're called reinforcing rods or reinforcing bar. If you go to a concrete supply place, they typically come in 10 or 12 foot lengths, but they can cut it to size. I have quite a few of these, and I usually get anywhere from 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch diameter rods, and I drive them down into the ground. So if I'm going to use a large one, I'm going to use a 3/4 inch. I will get a rod that is probably anywhere from 8 to 10 feet long. Get on a ladder, drive it down into the ground, 2 to 2 feet or so, and then I just use that as a basic support. And then I will wire in branches or twigs around it to essentially cover it. And so I'm making kind of a post type structure, but it's made up of all of these different smaller pieces of wood that I've salvaged, or branches that I salvage. Just make sure that you have some of it that is small enough in diameter for the clematis to go around. And then I usually loosely wrap it with some galvanized or copper wire. And then this is my very kind of rustic support for clematis to grow up. So I have a number of these in my garden. In addition, my partner is into metalworking, and so I'll say, I have this clematis I want to plant. I need something that's going to be 8 feet above the ground. I want it to kind of look obelisk-like, and here's the diameter of the stuff that I want, and then he will make it up for me.
Lucky. And I love
Yeah,
your
yeah,
description of the rustic rebar
yeah,
structure
yeah.
because, that's something any of us can DIY pretty
Right,
easily.
right, right.
Mm.
Yeah, and if you don't know what rebar is, just go into a hardware store, ask them if they have rebar, and just tell them you need something that's 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and you want to start with a 10-foot long piece,
Mm,
and they'll get you set up.
great.
Yeah.
And so for our final minutes, how about let's talk about our favorite varieties and maybe some of the new ones that we're
Hmm.
trialing and coming on the market. And I
Yeah.
love that you mentioned Polish Spirit because it was given to me years ago as Polish Sprite.
Oh.
It was a mistake on the tag.
Hmm.
So for years I was calling it Polish Sprite. And so, yes, Polish Spirit, I can attest as well. Super easy beginning clematis to have in the
Yeah.
garden.
Yeah. And another one that I would not be without, I mentioned, is Venosa violacea. This is an old variety. It's a wonderful purple. Um, and the nice thing about it is running down the middle of each of the tepals. So the brightly colored things we don't call petals in clematis because clematis don't have true petals or sepals. So when they don't do that, we call them tepals. So there's brightly colored parts, the tepals. It has a white bar running down the middle of each deep purple tepal. And so it's this star look to it because of that white running down the middle. Really beautiful. And, I'm a working person, so I get to see my garden very early in the morning or in the evening. And as the sun is setting, these just glow because it's that dark purple in the back and the white running through the middle of each one. So it's really nice to see at twilight how bright it is. And it's one of those easy to grow, cut it back to 6 to 12 inches every winter kind of clematis. So that's one that I really love. Um, Another one that is a little bit more unusual but easy to grow is called Roguchi. And this is a big, deep purple urn-shaped one.
Mm.
Now, this is one that will not attach, so you need to give it some kind of support. And I grow this up through an obelisk that my partner made me, and it is about 10 to 12 inches in diameter. And I have this planted in the middle. And I just make sure when it's first growing in the spring, and it will get up to 8 feet tall, that it grows up through the middle of that. And it started flowering about 2 weeks ago with these wonderful deep purple urns.
Hmm.
And it makes a wonderful cut flower. And actually, any of the clematis make wonderful cut flowers. And if you cut them as they're just opening, they will last in a vase for 7 to 10 days if you give them
Hmm.
good treatment. They're
A-
really, really wonderful.
And how much of the vine can you cut back on there? Because I'm always worried of cutting back too much to use as a cut flower.
If you have a good hardy plant, you can cut it back really quite hard.
Mm, okay.
It's not like you're going to be taking every blossom. It's not like you're going to
Hmm.
be removing all of the foliage of the plant. Um, Usually for Roguchi, I mean, I will usually cut individual blossoms and cut a stem of anywhere from probably 6 to 10 inches on those.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I can attest that I see Rigucci at many public gardens, and people go crazy when they
yeah,
see it. They just love it. You should see surrounded by photographers usually.
yes, yep,
So that's a
yeah,
great one. And
yeah.
earlier you had talked about some of the big, wide open ones, which I had always referred to as the dollar store flowers because
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
literally looks like somebody went and bought a bunch of fake flowers from the dollar store and stuck it on a trellis. Like
Yeah,
when you come up to, you're like, this is a real flower. It's big.
yeah,
They're so big and dramatic.
yeah.
So maybe some of your favorites from that category.
Yes. So, they're going to have some of these that are going to be flowering like in the May time, the
Hmm.
really early ones, or ones that are going to be flowering a little bit later on. So you're going to recognize some of these names because some of them are quite old, like Jack Manii, which is going to be flowering very shortly. Big purple is probably one of the most popular. It's an old one. It was introduced in 1858, believe it or not.
Wow.
So it's been around for a long
Yeah,
time.
that's been blooming for me for in DC for a couple weeks now. But
Oh,
yeah,
is it?
it's
Okay.
a
All right.
long time bloomer too. It just
Yeah.
keeps on going and going.
Yeah, Hagley Hybrid is another old one that is of that large group like that. Guernsey Cream, the President. The newer one that I really like is Warshawska Nike or Warsaw Nike. It's deep red velvet, red violet, and the flowers almost look like velvet. So it's a really, really nice one. Westerplatte is bright red. So red's kind of a neat color in it. One of my favorites in these large flowered ones, which just started flowering not long ago, is one that is called Bletkinioniol. And I'm sorry for pronunciation of some of these. This is a Polish variety. Sometimes it's translated as blue angel, which is what it actually means.
Hmm.
But pale blue flowers, and along the edges of each of the tepals, it's a little wavy, and it's this gorgeous pale blue. Um, Cardinal Wyszynski is a really nice one. Prince Charles is a wonderful light blue,
Mm.
and that's a very nice one. In that group like that, some of the newer ones I'm really excited about are we just have so many that are kind of coming on the market now. So it makes it really, really interesting. But one is called Dutch Sky. This is one that I picked up in Holland a number of years ago. And in 2014, I organized a clematis trial because I was having the International Clematis Society come here several years after that. And so we started planting a bunch of plants in 2013 to welcome the Clematis Society. And I worked with breeders at several different places in Europe. So in Holland, in Britain, in Poland, and we imported clematis that we had in the trial. And so we did those trials here in the Delaware Valley. The three main locations were the Scott Arboretum, also at Longwood Gardens and at Chanticleer. And so we had 52 different cultivars, and we all were growing at least 3 of each cultivar. And then we had, probably 10 or 12 different private gardens that we gave subsets of those to plant in that. But the number one out of all of them from our record keeping is one that is called Dutch Sky. And it's one that I found in Holland from a nurseryman in Holland who introduced it. And it is a wonderful pale blue. When it first comes out, it's pale blue. As the days go on, it gets a bit whiter. Very vigorous, gorgeous, gorgeous plant. And it was the favorite of all of us. A very early one that is large flowered is a newer one that is called Sugar Sweet Blue or Sugar Sweet Lilac. It comes in both colors. And the nice thing is they're fragrant, which is a new thing in clematis. So these were bred by a friend of mine from Holland, Ton Hannek, and wonderful plants. I had flowering that went on for almost 3 weeks this year, starting in April, and it was the nicest thing. Flowered really well in a very, very lightly shaded area. And the fragrance is nice. The color is nice. Just a beautiful plant.
Can you describe that fragrance?
I would describe it as a very light floral lilac kind of fragrance.
Okay.
Yeah. With a bit of sweetness. Yeah.
And you mentioned it tolerates shade, and that reminds me of one of my favorites,
Light
which
shade.
is
Yeah.
light shade. I
Very
was going
light
to
shade.
say Silver Moon is one I recommend that blooms for me in almost full shade.
Oh, good.
And it just blooms up a storm. I've got it trained up the side of my gazebo, which is under oak trees. So
Mm-hmm.
got the
Yeah.
shade of the gazebo and the shade of the trees. So if it can bloom there, I feel like it can bloom in almost all
Yeah.
shade situations.
Yeah. In the old fashioned variety, Hagley Hybrid, which is a pale pink, it actually looks much better in the shade because those blossoms, if they're in full sun, they really bleach out and it almost
Yeah.
looks to kind of a grayish pink. But if it's in some shade, then it'll be the really beautiful shade of pink that it should be. So there are some that can do pretty well in some light shade like that. If people are looking for varieties, the International Clematis Society has a free publication on the website. So once again, clematisinternational.com. And if you just go to the link along the side and look for the tab that is recommended clematis. So these are clematis basically from a worldwide group, and we divide them up. So we probably have probably 40 or 50 different clematis in the different groups, different flowering times. It's like these are the ones that we can recommend pretty much growing anywhere clematis can be grown. So it's a really great list to download and take a look at what those are. So
Great.
it's a really nice one.
Yeah, we'll definitely include that link as well. And for some trial ones, I was going to ask you your opinion of Taiga, which I've been trialing and I just love. It's more of a filled purple green, so it's
Yeah.
Taiga.
Yes.
Taiga.
Yeah.
Have you been growing that one?
We have. And I have to say, that's not a beginner's clematis. It's really neat. And some people just love these kind of double or semi-double flowers. And that's one in that group. They are a little bit more challenging to grow. Taiga's nice because it doesn't get huge. It stays a bit more compact. But people just kind of have to understand a little bit more about how to grow it. You don't want to cut that one back real hard. You want to keep some of the old stems so you have some of those early blossoms with it. So I would just caution, that's probably not one to start with, but it really is an interesting one. Also, there's a whole series of new ones that are offered by a breeder from the Isle of Guernsey, Raymond Evison. And these are making their way onto the US market. And a number of these are I really like because he's breeding for compactness. So something that will be in the range of maybe 3 to 4 feet. And then he has some that even are smaller. He's calling the window box series. So these can be used in a large pot, a large container on your patio with a little bit of trellis. And they most of them have larger flowers, really beautiful flowers with some interesting coloring. Cezanne is one, and
Hmm.
Sally is another one that I really like. Um, but a number of these are Raymond Evison Clematis. So if you just search for that Raymond Evison Clematis, you're going to see a number of those. And there are some wholesale nurseries in the United States that are growing these. So these are going to become more available in our garden centers for some of these more compact clematis. So it's a whole new niche of
Oh, yeah.
where they could be grown.
Especially for apartment, patio, rooftop
Yeah.
gardens. I have been seeing them trained on small, like a 2 foot or 3 foot trellis stuck right
Hmm.
in the middle of a large container.
Yeah.
So perfect for that small space
Yeah.
gardener.
And what we've done for some of those, they're flowering now. If we cut them back, so cut the whole thing back by a half, give it a bit of compost or some fertilizer, make sure you give it a good watering a couple times a week. You will get reflowering again in 6 weeks. And really, it is 6 weeks. You could almost time it exactly for that. You'll get new shoots come out and flowering in 6 weeks. So you could get several flowerings through the year with these by treating them that way.
Great advice. Yeah, and let's close out maybe talking about fertilizing and
Mhm.
any tips for that because do they need fertilizer?
They do. Actually, clematis really appreciate nutrients in the soil. So, but I'm not saying that you have to be applying a chemical fertilizer. For one thing, for clematis, in selecting the site, it should be a good drainage site. Clematis like to have even moisture. Okay, so regular moisture during the growing season, but I'm not saying soggy or wet or where water would puddle after a heavy rain. So they need decent drainage. They should have good quality soil. So mix in lots of compost before you even plant the plant. Typically, what I do for mine is I will use my own generated compost. So I'll do a top dressing of that, in late winter when I'm doing my pruning, trimming, cleaning up around the clematis. I will put some of my own compost down. And then if I need to add additional, so if I'm going to be pruning them back, after flowering to get them to reflower, I will usually use an organic slower release fertilizer, something lower in nitrogen. So something like you would use for vegetables, an organic fertilizer.
Hmm.
So that's what I do with mine. But they do need to, if you want them to reflower and you want them to really be vigorous, you will have to be adding some nutrients over time, either through compost or some organic fertilizer, that type of thing. But the watering during the summer is really important. So I try to remember if we haven't had a half an inch to an inch of rain each week, I will just make sure that I carry a bucket or two of water over to those individual plants and make sure that I'm watering them.
Good to know, especially this kind of dry spring that we've been having in the mid-Atlantic and the East, because you tend to, ignore the vines. You're looking at things that are wilting, and,
Hmm.
and that
Right.
those usually are kind of the set it and forget it plants. So good to know that we need to keep on top of that watering.
Yeah, if you see a clematis that is wilting because of dry, it's like, okay, you're probably going to be losing that stem then, because they really
Hmm.
are quite tough and tolerant. And one of the things that used to, if you look in old gardening books, they always say, plant the roots in the shade, in the top in the sun.
Hmm.
Well, it wasn't the shade. I mean, basically the idea was keep the roots cool, but I mean, keeping them moist. So a good layer of mulch or other things like that. So you don't want to plant it where the roots are like in hot competition with other things. So
Hmm.
even if you're planting it so it's going to grow up through a shrub or into a tree, plant it far enough away from the root system of those other plants so it's not competing for the moisture.
Good tip. How can our listeners follow up and get more information from you?
Well, they could contact the Scott Arboretum. So it's scottarboretum.org. And, there's a way to get in touch with us there. I'm also, I teach at Longwood Gardens. So I have taught classes at Longwood Gardens all about clematis, a several-week class there for that. Or contacting the International Clematis Society. So those are all ways to kind of get in touch with us here. Or come to any of our conferences here at the Scott Arboretum.
Great. I'll have those links in our show notes. And I thank you so much, Jeff, for this deep dive into all things clematis. I think we all learned some new things. And I think I've added a few names to our shopping list as well.
Okay, and I think once you look at that, the recommended clematis list, you'll probably add a few more than that too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Kathy. It's been fun.
Penstemon plant profile. Beard tongue, Penstemon species, is a North American native plant that is often used in pollinator gardens. The flower is tubular and similar in looks to a miniature snapdragon. Penstemon is a nectar source for specialized native bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. Planted in full sun, it is hardy to USDA zones 3 to 10. There are dwarf selections and species that can grow up to 5 feet tall. Typically, most Penstemon cultivars are about 3 feet tall. Penstemon is deer and rabbit resistant. It is also drought tolerant and not picky about soil types. It does not need compost, aged manure, or really any fertilizer. However, this tough wildflower is known to be a short-lived perennial, so allow it to self-seed to extend the life of the plant in your garden, or divide and replant it in the spring. In recent years, new breeding programs of penstemons have brought us plants with dark foliage and longer lives, including Husker Red, the perennial plant of the year in 1996, Dark Towers, Blackbeard, and Midnight Masquerade have joined the Penstemon parade in recent years. The Royal Horticultural Society has more than 950 penstemon in its plant list. 2 species native to the Chesapeake Bay watershed region are Eustis Creek beard tongue, Penstemon australis, and foxglove beard tongue, Penstemon digitalis, and 1 species native to the eastern U.S. is Penstemon smallii. Penstemon, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, in my own home garden, Hydrangea and Spirea are putting on their show and looking marvelous. Over at the community garden plot, we're harvesting the garlic and handfuls of blackberries. We've planted zucchini seeds, pepper seedlings, and tomato seedlings, and the peas and lettuce greens are starting to peter out in the coming summer heat. We want to thank our latest listener supporter, Luella R. Benedetto. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast. And we have an offer for all listeners from Dr. Alan Armitage. He is offering a discount of free domestic shipping when ordering any of his books through June 2024 at alanarmitage.net. Simply enter the code LASTWORD at checkout to get that offer. Some local gardening events we wanted to call to your attention include a talk on great ground covers to the Silver Spring Garden Club by myself, Kathy Jentz, on Monday, June 19th. This was rescheduled from a May date, and this takes place at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland at 7:30 p.m. that evening. You can find out full details at silverspringgardenclub.com or at our Facebook page. This event is open to the public and free to attend. I will be signing and selling both my book on ground covers and the urban garden before and after the talk. You can attend the Under the Arbor Tussies Mussies program, A Bouquet with a Message, on Saturday, June 24th at the National Herb Garden inside the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. This is being hosted by the USNA chapter of the Herb Society of America, and you can find out more details at herbsociety.org. No registration required. You can just drop by. And Washington Gardener magazine is hosting our photo contest for our 17th annual set of winners at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens in Vienna, Virginia. The opening reception is on Sunday, July 30th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. at the Meadowlark Visitor Center lobby. And after that, you're able to view the winning photos on the display wall through August 30th. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with the new book Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional, everyday grass lawn. In the last 3 years alone, over 23 million American adults converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now are looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn is knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Author Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the details on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Available at bookstores now and also at Quarto.com, where you can get 30% off using discount code GARDENING30. In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. Whether you're growing edible plants or beautiful flowers, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the Urban Garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Good day, everybody. It's Dr. A in the garden with the last word. And I'm sitting in my garden right now, and it's about 85 degrees, humid. Birds are happy. Plants are reasonably happy because I've done my best I can in the spring when the temperature's been cool to make them strong. I've enhanced my soils so that they actually have dirt to grow in. I've fertilized as needed. So the plants are ready to go into this heat. And there's no doubt about it. I don't care where you live, it gets hot and getting hotter all the time. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're not really going to do anything about it except, as I mentioned, we're going to make the plants stronger in the spring. So when they go into these stress times, and that's exactly what it is, they can handle it. Of course, we're going to have to perhaps irrigate more. Of course, we're going to have to be ready when it doesn't rain for 3 weeks and it's 90 degrees. Of course, we're going to have to be ready for that. But we're gardeners. We're used to this. This is just one more thing that we put up with. But let me tell you that the only thing that you have to think about when you're talking about what's the deal with heat is nighttime temperatures. Daytime temperatures are not the issue because during the day, plants are making food through photosynthesis and sunlight. Of course, if it's really hot during the day, a hydrangea is going to wilt. I mean, who puts a hydrangea in the sun anyway? But of course they are. Or plants with large, wide, thin leaves, they're going to be the ones you see wilting more often than not. If you want to have a plant that doesn't wilt, then get a plant that has very, very small leaves. Cacti or sedums with very waxy leaves. These plants don't lose water, and that's the deal, and that's why they wilt. But again, as far as the health of the plant is concerned, when it gets hot and stays hot at night, plants respire. That's the opposite of building food. It's essentially using food, and the more they respire, the weaker the stems and the harder it is for these plants to do well. So if it's 80 degrees at night, then you've got that's when we have real issues, and we have to do our best, as they say, keep the plants strong and water as needed. But it's not day temperatures, it's night temperatures that become an issue. So don't sweat it too much when it goes to 90 degrees during the day. Let's drink lots of tea or drink lots of wine. The plants themselves will drink lots of water, but they'll be fine. And if the night temperature gets high and stay high, well, then you may have to think about what kind of plants you want to put in there. I'm living in North Georgia. It's hot, it's humid in the summer, but I'm doing just fine, thank you. And my plants are doing very, very well. So, heat, we got it. We live with it. We do our best to put up with it and to make our plants as strong as they can be so that they will put up with it as much as we do. Well, that's my last word on heat. And heat in the garden and essentially nighttime temperatures. Have fun, stay dirty, stay happy, and always have something to look forward to. Be a gardener. Until next time, this is Dr. A in the garden with the last word.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.